All right, welcome everybody. I'm Scott Maier. This is Artist Network Drawing Together. We meet Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So I'm just getting stuff set up here. Reading through the chat, looks like everything seems to be going okay, but I'm seeing some issues with the audio, so I just want to adjust that quickly. So this is what we're working on today, this drawing of an iceberg. I used this tinted charcoal, this Derwent tinted charcoal for this. So I've been playing around with this for a little while, and I kind of struggled with it a little bit, trying to figure out how to make it really work for the subject that I'm drawing. So it's not just kind of like a gimmick, I guess, to use the color, but I really wanted a reason to be using these tinted charcoals. And this subject, I think, really kind of presented itself. So that's what I'll be using today, but if you're working with just straight charcoal, that'll be fine. Graphite, I think, would work really well for this. Thomas is asking, what do you think about using gray paper? I think that would work really well for this, especially to pull out some of the light here. And I really considered doing that, but I feel like I've been working on toned paper quite a bit lately, and I just wanted a different challenge. So I do want to go through the chat here and make sure I didn't miss anything. I just want to say hi to everybody. I know I'm really excited to be here today. I'm glad we could make it work. I know everybody's kind of in the thick of things for the holidays. So I appreciate you all joining me today. Let me see. JC is saying, working on toned paper with some tinted graphite and maybe some pastel. I think that sounds like a great idea. I haven't played around with the tinted charcoal or tinted graphite, but I do have some that I may use at some point in the future. All right, so let's get to it. So this is about an 8x10 sheet of paper. This is actually, it's this stuff. It's the Hanamulla bamboo paper that I picked up a little while back. They sent me some to play around with, and I really like it for charcoal. With this tinted charcoal, it's a little bit harder. It's like physically a harder material than some of the other charcoals I've been used to working with, and so I have found that I've needed to just play around with different papers. So if you are working with this material and you're finding that it's scratching or just not lifting off the paper, just experiment with different materials and try just to see what works. So I found that with the rag paper that I really prefer using, that it wasn't kind of optimal for this. So, but this bamboo paper works really well. So let's get to it. So let's see, the erasers I'm using today, I've got this retractable eraser that I use for some of the fine lines, and I really like that. And then I have just a rubber eraser, my kneaded eraser. I have my blending stump, and then I actually have 5 of the colors of the tinted charcoal. Let me pull these up here so you can see what I'm working with. So I've got mountain blue, which I actually use for the iceberg. Now, it's not a strong blue, so this is all about creating subtle temperature shifts, not necessarily creating a full color drawing, but I found that the blue was closest to that. I have this ocean deep, which actually worked really well for the ocean portion. It's really nice, rich, deep color. And then I have dark, which is just a black. It's a rich black charcoal. And then the lavender for the sky. So what I was looking at doing is creating a contrast in temperature. So I have kind of that lavender sky, a little bit more red against the blue in the iceberg, and then going for a deeper, richer blue here in the ocean, and trying to create just kind of push that contrast through temperature shifts in addition to value control. So hopefully that makes sense. Actually, what I want to do, let me set these down here. I want to be careful not to break the lead, so I'm going to be gentle there. I want to grab a graphite and just kind of lay out. I started to map out the proportions a little bit, but I wanted to kind of go through that again, establishing really the horizon line, which is a little tricky to see because it's so diffused up in those areas. If you look at the reference image, so if you are new and you want the reference image, it's in the link below in the description, and you can also share your work when you're done at Artist Network. There's a link in the description to that as well, so you can follow along if you'd like, or you can sit back and watch and draw later, whatever works for you. But if you have that up and you need a kind of a closer view than what you're seeing here, it might be helpful. So what I want to do though is kind of orient myself a little bit with a horizon line, which is generally in the center, but it's a little bit lower. Like I said, it's a little bit kind of diffused in that area. So I'm just kind of giving myself some rough marks. And I wanted to map out the basic shape of the iceberg here. Angle sighting is a great tool to use for this. So if you're new to this, what angle sighting is, it's a way to transfer the angle, the slope of an edge onto your drawing. So if you have your reference in front of you, close one eye, align your pencil with an edge, and then swing it on top of your drawing, you can kind of get the general angle, the general slope of the object that you're targeting there. And so I want to kind of rough in and just give myself some basic shapes, and in particular kind of looking for these kind of triangular forms. And I find it is most effective to think about this as a sequence of straight marks rather than any curves that you might see in there. And I just want to be thinking about major shapes here and mostly kind of placing the iceberg properly, giving myself enough room on the left and the right, enough room above and below. Because one of the things I liked about this reference is that there is enough of the sky and the ocean showing to get a sense of the scale in which the iceberg is kind of floating. So you can see that it's a massive object, but it's also in the context of something that's even more massive. So I think that's generally, this is going to be pretty much close enough to what I need. So you may take a little bit of time to kind of map this out for yourself. I did that preparatory drawing that gave me a little bit of a leg up on all of this. That first time I did this, it took me a little bit longer to arrive at the correct proportions. And if you want to kind of boost that a little bit, one of the things you can do is just hold your paper on top of your screen, and that serves as a light box, and you can essentially trace the image, or you can put it up on a window, or you can, if you cover the back, if you want to print it out, cover the back of that sheet with graphite, lay it on top of your drawing, and then kind of trace over your image, your printout. It'll transfer the image. But what's nice about this object is you don't necessarily need to get it 100% accurate. It's up to you how far you want to push that. But it being an iceberg, they come in all different shapes and sizes, so you can be a little off with it, and it's going to be convincing as a subject. All right, there are a bunch of new people, so welcome, Matthew, your first timer. Seeing anybody else? I'd love to see where I'm viewing from, people from all over the world. So this is awesome. All right, and if you do have any questions, any observations, if you want to share your own experience, we can do that here in the chat. I'd love to hear how your drawings are going in particular. So if you're following the same approach, or if you're taking your own approach to complete this drawing, I'd love to hear how that's all going. There's a lot of subtlety happening in the icebergs themselves. So what I want to do, I think, is I feel pretty confident that it's mapped out effectively. I'm just doing a kind of quick check-in, comparing the reference image to the drawing that's in front of me, and to see if there's anything major, but I do want to kind of establish this a little bit. All right, put that graphite away. I don't need that anymore. I'm going to pull out the lavender charcoal, and I just want to start to block in kind of the sky a bit. And I'm kind of starting with the corners because there's a bit of this kind of vignetting that's cool in the reference photo. It gets a little bit darker in those edges. It's a nice photograph. So I found this on Pixabay as a source for really cool reference images. So just using the side of the pencil, I do use a razor blade to sharpen this so that I expose a bit more of that core. And that allows me to cover a broad area. And then as you're building up your layers, take multiple passes with it. The first pass is going to be a bit clumsy, and then you can kind of wash over it again, and it'll get smoother, and you do it again, and it'll get even smoother. But kind of expect that first pass to be a little bit chunky, like I said. So Hello, Inez. Welcome. From Vermont, huh? Beautiful part of the country. I hope anybody on the East Coast is doing well after that big storm. And I'm kind of loosely being mindful of this negative space of the iceberg, but I'm not being super cautious because it can be really time consuming in the early stages to be precious with that edge. I find that in the end, it doesn't really matter. I'll show you some strategies that I use to keep that edge sharp. And as I go through, as I make these kind of multiple layers, these layers of washing that I'm putting on top of this with the charcoal, as I start to, as I kind of move over this repeatedly, I start to target the light areas. So kind of if you can identify kind of these heavier, darker areas, and then the gaps in between, you can start to target and fill in those areas, and that'll help to smooth it out. And some of this color, it kind of extends down into the water, so I'm just going to bring this down, kind of soften that transition. So this is just an early pass, and this is the first attempt that I made at this. It took me quite a while, and I'm hoping that this goes a little bit more, a little bit quicker for you all. But just so you know, if you're using the same materials or you're experimenting with something new, just be patient with yourself. Like I said, it's going to look faster and easier for me because I've already done it. So, like I said, but my first attempt was pretty rough. And I'm actually going a little bit darker than I did that first go around. I was being really sensitive and kind of tentative with the material at first because I'm still getting used to this tinted charcoal. And so I have a little bit more confidence with it now, and I feel like I can be a bit more direct with it. Let me switch to that ocean deep. It's a little bit tricky now that with this paper taped down, I have to kind of contort myself into various positions in order to get into some of these areas. When I did that initial sketch or the initial drawing, I was able to turn this around. Let's just see how I do. Again, I'm kind of starting in the corners, and I'm being, I'm kind of starting heavy at the bottom and kind of lifting my way up to create a softer transition. I just don't want those harsh edges. It's the first time I had drawn an iceberg, which is kind of fun. So it was like I said, it was a cool image, and it being winter and all, and I thought this was a suitable subject. I'm working on the drawing for next week, which is a bridge, a suspension bridge that I found a really cool image of. So I'm struggling with that right now. I started it and it's not going well, so I'm gonna start over again. Sometimes when they're doing it live, it can be a little intimidating. So I like to prepare in advance. So. How's everybody else doing? I'd love to hear. I've heard from some of you what materials you're using. If you're using the same materials, anybody else using the tinted charcoal? Anybody used them in the past, or anybody using anything different for this drawing? And if you have any questions, want me to kind of restate something, or if you have a different approach to anything that I'm mentioning, I love to hear it. I guess that's the kind of the main objective of this show, is for us to gather together to share our experiences. I don't consider myself a master artist, but drawing is a skill that will help in all other art forms, and I felt like it was an area that I needed to develop, and with a group of us drawing together, I feel like we can all advance those skills more rapidly. So if you are new, I just want you to know that this isn't necessarily about how to draw properly. I'm just going to share my experiences, but I also love to hear how it goes for you. So using this overhand grip, it allows me to keep that pencil tip sharp, and I'll be using that especially as I get up towards the edges. You know, down here in the lower portion, I can be you know, really loose. I don't need sharp edges here. And I want to kind of prioritize these horizontal marks because that's going to help set me up with the texture of the water a bit more effectively. But it's really challenging to get it down here. Can't quite. I've got this raised bar down here that I can't quite get over. And I hadn't really considered that in my preparatory drawing because, like I said, I was able to rotate the paper underneath my hand in order to get the angles that I needed. Relaxologia coloring. All right, welcome, and it's good to hear that you are working with the tinted charcoal as well. Yeah, I really dig it. You know, color temperature in charcoal is something that I've always kind of paid attention to because you can get some brands that'll be a little bit cooler, you know, more kind of a silvery quality than others that might be a little bit more earthy. And there can be a difference between working with vine charcoal and versus compressed charcoal in terms of temperature. And then so these tinted charcoals kind of push that a little bit farther. So and I found it more effective for me to think about it more in terms of temperature rather than coloring. So I'm not coloring the drawing, I'm just nudging things a little bit more in the direction of their temperature. So I may end up having to sharpen this pencil a little bit later. So I'm going to take this paper towel, smooth it out a little bit. Like I said, I'm not being precious with that edge around the iceberg there. I want to bring those together a little bit. Actually, and that helps, that knocks that down significantly. So I'm picking up some of the charcoal here. It transferred to the upper portion, so it's kind of blending a little bit. So it's a very subtle temperature shift, and it may end up pushing that a little bit farther as we go through. All right, let's see. I think what I want to do is actually stick with this background a little bit farther, a little bit longer. I've still got a kind of rough map of the iceberg to know where I'm at, but now I can start to be a little bit more deliberate with the marks in that background. You can see this cloud line back here, for example. And then typically the way I work with charcoal, whether it's tinted or not, is to build it up in layers. And so it's, you know, you're taking multiple passes at your drawing. And, you know, rather than trying to hit the right value right out of the gate, you know, it's kind of a gradual building up of the material and aligning with the gradual development in my understanding of the subject. So it takes me a while to kind of wrap my head around what I'm actually drawing and the nuances, the subtlety, the correct proportion, perspective, things like that. That takes a while to develop. And so I let my drawing process kind of mirror that development in my observation. So my initial understanding of the subject is pretty simplistic, right? I can look at it and I recognize it as an iceberg, but I haven't taken any time to really study its unique characteristics. And so my drawing in these early stages kind of reflects that. It shows a simplistic interpretation of that, really just breaking it down into these basic forms. And then as I look at the subject more and understand it to a greater degree, that'll show up in the drawing. And then using the drawing process as a way to better understand the subject. So this is really just using the weight of the pencil itself. And if you just kind of move back and forth paying attention to the pressure, you can create a nice smooth gradation of that value. And now this lavender tinted charcoal is limited in terms of its value range, which is fine. You just kind of, it's good to know that right out of the gate. I don't need it to be really dark up here in the sky. Hello from Ireland. Welcome, welcome. That's one place I would definitely like to go. All right, so what I'm doing now is trying to just feather things out a little bit, leaving the center glow. But I do have this kind of dark stripe underneath the cloud bank here that passes behind the iceberg, and that's an important element in it. It helps to establish the point of view, and it helps to create an overlapping of form so that this projects forward. So it's, sometimes, we end up inventing things. So if I were looking at this in real life and there were no clouds back there, I may try to invent something that helps that creates some sort of line or guide behind there so that I have something for the iceberg to overlap. So that's what this kind of soft, dark stripe serves as. And as I'm making these marks, it's kind of a lift and a landing on each of these marks. It's happening really fast, but I'm trying to prioritize pressure on the center of each stroke. So it's kind of landing gently and lifting off the page, and that helps to kind of feather things out a little bit. And I think actually I want to, and I can play around with these value relationships a little bit more later as well. Change up the direction of my marks. Get some cross hatching. Let me see what happens if I smooth this out a little bit. I want to be really gentle because I don't want to lift off too much material, because then what can happen is I can end up laying down charcoal, just lifting it back off, laying it down, lifting it off, and not really advancing in the drawing at all. So I want to just be mindful of that. What do I want to do now? So I do have, like I said, I have this raised edge here, and that helps me in this drawing to kind of identify the horizon line a little bit. I can create kind of cleaner, straighter marks without having to pull out a straight edge. And in this center area, I'm going to kind of blend the lavender and then the ocean deep pencils, and kind of let them kind of blend together a little bit. How's that look? So what I'm doing now is I'm looking at the screen that you're observing, and that shows me a smaller scale version of the drawing. It's equivalent to stepping back quite a ways, and it helps me to see if there's any issues with the proportions. Make sure I'm on target still. All right. How are we doing? Mr. S, working in layers is what we do in watercolor painting. I am not a watercolor painter particularly. I mean, I have worked in watercolor, but that stuff's really hard. I'm typically an oil painter, and I see some great watercolor artists, and I'm always in awe of that ability. There is a kind of a sense of strategy that is helpful to have as a watercolor artist, and I have some strategies that I employ as an oil painter, but I find it even more relevant in watercolor work. And you see some artists that are thinking many moves ahead as they're layering down, the color. And so when I watch great watercolor artists work, it's like magic seeing it all come together, because they'll sometimes these layers will seem really kind of abstract, and you might question what these watercolor artists are doing, and then it all kind of comes together as they execute their vision. So I'm just kind of blending that lavender and the ocean deep a little bit. It's interesting, on my screen, the color contrast isn't quite as evident. So you may be seeing it, depending on your monitor, your viewing situation, you may be thinking it's just a straight up charcoal drawing, but I can see the color contrast quite a bit more clearly, I feel, than what I see on the screen. So just putting that out there. All right, so I'm kind of digging that atmosphere, and I want to kind of start from that place of atmosphere, build the iceberg out of that, rather than create everything that as a sharp edge and then diffuse the edges to create that light and atmosphere. I want to start from that and then gradually pull it out. I found that that's just generally just what works best for me. All right, what am I doing now? Let's work on, let's start on the iceberg. So I've got this retractable eraser, and I've taken a razor blade and I've kind of cut this wedge into it. And that allows me to treat this really like a drawing tool. So I'm going to do some negative drawing. Because I really want to be careful with the edges on this. I really like the delicacy of this iceberg. And if I'm too heavy with the contour lines, I'll lose that delicacy. And like I said, I want this to feel like it's in this Arctic atmosphere. And so I want these edges to kind of become lost and found a little bit. And so that's why I'm kind of choosing to render the edges this way rather than really draw a hard line. So I'm trying to prioritize the light areas. I see some areas where I'm going to drop in a shadow. And I'm thinking about the directionality of the marks, even with the eraser, to try to, starting to think through the structure of the iceberg. What are the various planes? And then changing the direction of the marks to suit those planes as much as possible. There's that edge along in there. And this is all going to get dark. This is largely in shadow. So I can kind of let that be. And then there's a little bit of light that comes up right up in here on that back portion. And it falls into shadow. There we go. So that just starts to sharpen up the edge and define that form. What I need is a brush. I should pick one up. Sina is asking, what pencil am I using? So I'm using these Derwent tinted charcoals for this. And so I have a variety of pencils that I'm using. So if you're gonna just joining us, this is what I'm using. We've got this lavender ocean deep, and this dark, which is just a straight black charcoal, and this mountain blue, and then white, which I'm gonna bring in towards the end. So that's what I'm working with today. This, I think you follow the same process really with any drawing material, perhaps a bit more challenging if you're working with pen and ink, but if you're using graphite, if you're using any other type of charcoal, it should work for this. Gigi, yeah, we have a question about Gigi. So some of you have been following Gigi Chen on her Painting Together page, and so yeah, she's season 1 for her is done, and we're working on developing next steps with her. So stay tuned for that. It was a great show that she put together. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I've got this. This is the mountain blue, and I'm going to start to kind of fill in some of these areas. I'm using the side of the pencil first, so I don't need these sharp edges at this point, no pun intended. And I'm targeting kind of the shadow shapes in this. So this primary iceberg is is really all in shadow. There's just that kind of halo around that edge. And so what I'm doing is I just want to kind of block that all in, but I'm trying to think through the major forms. I think what I want to do actually is I need to wash everything. I need to bring up a whole wash, and then I'll look for some variation. In my general approach, you know, and it's not something that I do 100% of the time, but in general, I like to think about working from the center of the object towards the edges rather than from the edges inward. And in part because it takes a while to really figure out what's happening at the edges, and it allows me to kind of creep up on them a little bit so I can control the visibility of the edges more clearly. I'll kind of talk a bit about that as I go, but you know, so for in this section, I'm going to lay down some of this blue. But leave that edge fairly unfinished at this point. I'm not spending a whole lot of time. I'm just blocking in values. And what I know to be coming for me in the future is this is going to get quite a bit darker, so I don't have to be super sensitive with that edge. I can go right over that water line, and I can redefine it. You know, and I kind of work this way because I used to really fuss over those things, and I would do that too early in the drawing. So what would happen is I would spend all of this time fussing over those edges, and then they just get destroyed anyways, or I would need to move them. You know, something would be wrong that would need to be corrected. And so I kind of learned to just kind of chill out a little bit early on in terms of making things really precise and nice and clean, and then sharpen them up at the very end. So this is a great stage to be squinting at the subject. That helps to reduce the desire to focus on the details. And let's see, and there's going to be a lot going on in this area here that we'll use the eraser for. But I kind of like the ghostly light that seems to be forming already on it. Let me pull out the blending stump. Just kind of filling things in, and I'm kind of using this diagonal mark making because there seems to me, it feels like a diagonal kind of thrust to the texture in this. So I'm not just smoothing it out, but I'm also trying to think ahead in terms of the texture and the direction of the marks that will help me to render that texture. I'm just going to blend that all together. And I'm going to come back in there and clean that up a little bit later. What's kind of cool though is you can start to see the reflection forming in there. It wasn't necessarily intentional. And what I try to avoid are halos around the edges. And so what I mean by that is, you know, if I'm working on this edge, for example, and there's a shift in value in that lavender in that background, if it gets darker or lighter, it can flatten things out. So I want to just be mindful of that and try to avoid that as much as possible. You know, we can correct it when we need to, but so at this point, it's worth it for me to kind of blend these areas together to help reduce those halos and then sharpen up the edge again, rather than increasingly becoming more fixated on keeping those edges sharp. So that's why I'm not really concerned with sharp edges now. I'm moving towards sharpness. Krish has a question. Yes, I'd love to see. And you're asking the pencils. Yeah, so if you need to, you can kind of watch back again, but these are the pencils I'm using, the Derwent tinted charcoals today. But like I said, if you have just graphite, if you have you know, just regular charcoal, that will work just fine as well. I just chose to use this tinted one for fun. But the principles are really the same for any medium here. And then the paper that I'm using is actually, it's a Honolulu bamboo paper, which is really kind of fun to work with. I really like the way it accepts the charcoal. But if I didn't have that, I would be looking for a straight up charcoal paper, something that's really designed for this material. All right, here we go. Let's see. I think what I want to do is now come back in. I'm going to work my way from the background forward. There's still stuff I need to do in that sky, I think. Like, I want to lighten up this area. But I'm going to leave, like, you know, we can see there's light on the horizon, but I'm going to leave that dark for now until I really kind of resolve the main focal point of the iceberg. Because then what I may end up doing is rather than lightening this area, may darken the areas behind it to create that contrast. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking at this point. I can see some of these areas I need to blend them together, and I'm going to use the eraser again to sharpen it back up. So a lot of it is, and what I love about working with charcoal is the idea of laying it down, wiping it down, building it back up, and wiping it down again. That's a lot of fun. All right, so I've got this sharp edge now since I've been using the side of the pencil. It gives me that sharp edge when I need it. So I'm still using the side of the pencil. And when I need that fine point, I can kind of just roll a little bit, and then I can get that sharp point. And what I'm looking for are the kind of just the shadow shapes in the that background iceberg. And rather than draw a line along this edge, what I'm going to do is kind of work over that edge, and I'm going to use my eraser to cut that back out. So that's what I'm going to do here, kind of working up towards that edge. I might need to sharpen it a little bit at some point, but I'm going to let that be for now. Krishna's asking, what am I making? So this, if you want to follow along, the reference image to this iceberg is in the description below. I'm drawing that little iceberg that's below me on the screen. And so since this background iceberg is essentially a wall, it feels like a flat wall, I'm going to prioritize vertical marks. And if those marks become really visible, they'll just help to reinforce that vertical quality of that background wall. And so one of the things that's going to happen is that I can only go so light with this iceberg. If I need it to be brighter, I'm going to have to go back in and darken that background. So I'm just kind of putting that out there more for myself, help to keep my thoughts organized. But I'm going through, and you can see that I'm kind of working a little bit over here, moving over here, and I'm trying to jump around the subject, the object here, because it helps with my observations. I'm going to see these forms better if I don't sit on them too long. The more you stare at a subject, the more it gets distorted in the mind, and so that's what I'm kind of thinking about as I'm going through here. So just kind of laying in some of these darker shapes. So there's already a layer of that blue, the same blue that I'm working with, and now I'm going back in with an even darker pass to do some of these finer shadows. Now I'm under this side over here. And one of the things I'm also holding in my mind right now is that these areas here, like this dark shadow, I can go even darker in some of those areas. So it's a fairly dark form, but it's not the deepest part of the shadow. I'm trying to create kind of an average value for that shadow area. Christian's asking, can you use different kind of paper? Yeah, anybody, you can really use whatever paper works best for you. And so the paper you choose, generally you want it designed for the material you're using. So maybe a smooth paper for graphite, a rougher paper for charcoal, and if you can find one that's specifically designed for charcoal, that would be even better. But this, like with these tinted charcoals, they're a little bit harder than some other charcoals I've worked with, and so they don't work quite as well as on some papers, but I really like them on this bamboo paper. I'm just gonna try to find generally an average value back in here for this, and I'll use the eraser to pull out some of those details. And then as I come down here, this is where it gets tricky on this background iceberg, because you can see an alternating sequence of light and dark. So if you look up here, for example, you have the light highlight and it's darker on either side of it. You switch over here and now you're in shadow in the iceberg where it's darker than the sky behind it. You come down here and now this becomes lighter than the water underneath it. But this isn't as light as that. And so those are the things that I'm thinking about as I'm going is, it's kind of like putting together a puzzle, comparing the value relationships from one part to the other. So now what I'm doing here is actually drawing the water, so doing kind of a negative drawing by drawing the water, and that's going to reveal the shape of the iceberg at the bottom here. And I can refine that a little bit more later. You can see that lost edge right there, which I think it helps add to that sense of atmosphere. One of the little things that I start to observe too is that you see this shadow here that I just put in. I'm changing that angle slightly. So in the reference image, it almost feels like they run into one another. Then from the foreground to background, it creates what's called a tangent. And so I really want to kind of boost the contrast here and really make this more of a vertical edge than anything. And then in terms of texture, texture for me is all about creating natural formed marks rather than using the tip of the pencil to really render each and every crack. It's about kind of moving your material in the way the subject seems to flow through the space, but allowing it to do some work on its own. And so some of the texture that I create here may deviate from the subject a little bit, may not look exactly like the reference image, but I want it to feel, I wanted to make sure it feels natural, it feels like it's believable, more than it being 100% accurately kind of mirroring the reference image. Okay, so I'm kind of leaving this edge for now because again, I've kind of brought some of these values down on top of that edge, and I'll use my eraser to pull that back out. I still want to focus on the shadows here. So I'm going to switch back to that overhand grip, which is it's a great grip to use to create really fine lines. We tend to kind of prioritize using this tripod grip and holding it this way to get a sharp line, but I find I can actually get sharper lines using the side of the pencil if I'm just kind of gentle with it. Ethan is asking, do I think all artists should have great drawing skill? I think my short answer is no, but it's really helpful. I feel like I've seen some really great paintings, sculptures from people who have not spent as much time developing their drawing ability, and so I would hate for somebody to not create because they feel like they have insufficient drawing skill. For me, it's been really important. It's a big part of my work. and that's why I kind of started this series. Building my drawing skills helps me as a landscape painter. I like to paint out on location, and I need to get generally correct proportions, perspective, understand value relationships, things like that. And all of that is really helpful to learn through drawing. You know, there are lots of different ways to express yourself through visual art, and when it comes down to it, I think drawing is an essential element, but you know, for some people, it's really just a tool for solving a problem. It's a way to think through some problems, and but to serve a different purpose, maybe as a sculpture or a photograph or whatever. Now, having said that, I taught foundation classes for several institutions, and drawing is a foundation level class, and I think that's something that is necessary in order to progress in the college programs, is to pass your drawing classes. So as a prerequisite, yes, and there may be different requirements, but it's kind of I don't know if that satisfactorily answers the questions, but all right, so I'm going to do some negative drawing here, actually focus on the water to kind of create this edge along in here. You know, for me, I think that ultimately the power in drawing comes as a way to visualize what's happening in your head. This is a physical manifestation of thoughts that are happening up here, and you know, sometimes the resulting images are beautiful, sometimes they're not, but that process of just kind of working through things, I think, is really helpful. Beninas, I don't have charcoal pencil grades. Yeah, I mean, even if you have just a regular number 2 yellow graphite pencil, I think you go for it and draw. If you have charcoal, but it's only, say, a medium or a hard graphite, you know, just do what you can. What is a little heartbreaking sometimes, and I've worked with students that have said this, that kind of they'll limit themselves from working because they don't have the right materials. And now I think having good materials is really helpful. But like I said, if you're in a position where you just feel like drawing and you don't have the right materials, do what you can with it. Maybe acknowledge there may be limitations to what you can do, but you can still have a really wonderful experience. You can still learn from it. So if you don't have these right charcoals, that's totally fine. I think you can kind of walk away with something that's really satisfying to you, and nonetheless. So I'm still kind of making multiple passes through here, thinking through. Like as I'm going through, I'm thinking about the texture. I'm looking at the quality of the marks in each region of the iceberg that I'm going through. Because it changes up. You get some hard, sharp edges, like right in here, and it starts to get a little clunky in here. And so I'm changing up my marks to suit the type of shapes that I'm seeing in that area. And like I said, it may not match it 1-to-1, but I'm getting a general understanding of that. So it's a very gestural way of thinking about texture. And so even with a blending stump, as I do that, I want to keep that same focus. Is use the marks to help reinforce the type of shapes we're seeing in each of these areas, and try to see the cross contour. If you're kind of new to drawing and that term is confusing to you, a contour line represents the edge of a three-dimensional object. The cross contour lines are the marks that you make inside the form that reinforce its sense of three-dimensional form. It helps you to understand it as a three-dimensional object. And so when I go through these areas, I try to imagine that this is already a three-dimensional object. And what would happen to this material if I had this blending stump and I was moving it over a three-dimensional object? What would that path be? What path would that take through that space? And let that inform the marks that I'm making. James is saying, it looks like I'm careful to keep my drawing hand off the paper. It does help to have this raised bar here. I know some artists that use a maul stick or some sort of bridge to keep the hand off the page. And I've never really done that. It's just not a process that I've taken the time to explore. And I haven't really needed it. If I didn't have this bar, I would probably just be resting my hand on the drawing. And I would just know that this area would most likely just wipe away and I'd have to finish that last. So it just becomes part of the process. All right, and I don't want to get too caught up in the details. At this stage, I want to be suggesting some of these forms, but I know I'm gonna have to come back in a little bit later and sharpen up some of these areas. And I just want to evaluate whether or not it's suggesting, the light and shadow form the texture sufficiently here. Right there. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to come back in. I'm going to come back in and sharpen up these edges a little bit later. Edges are important. If you're going for a sense of realism, if you want your drawing to create the illusion of depth and light, reducing the reliance on a contour line, like drawing that edge, is going to help with that. So that's why I'm trying to minimize that as much as possible. And I'll just use a line wherever I need to sharpen it up, but I want to be really sensitive about that, because if I go in and I make that sharp edge with a heavy line, it's going to work against me. It's just going to flatten things out. But having said that, it doesn't necessarily mean that the drawing is better. That's just, if your objective is for realism, you want to be really careful with what's happening at those edges. All right, I think that's enough for now. And this whole area, it's most likely going to get kind of wiped down. So I'm not going to touch anything else now. I'm going to move to that water. And because I can keep my hand lifted off the page, I can be a bit more confident that it's going to be all right. I can work with that. So this is that deep, the ocean deep. So it's not black, but it is really dark. And I want to start to kind of sharpen up those edges here. Without relying on a line to create that edge. There's a thin shadow here, but it's not a line. And I think there is a difference in the mind. If I see this and I'm thinking this is a thin shadow, it works a bit better. It helps me to create a more lively edge. And so one of the things that can be helpful to master is really paying attention to the direction of the marks relative to the path that those marks are following along. So if I have, say, a dark edge along here, using horizontal marks that reference the wave pattern, but moving it down a vertical path, rather than running my marks vertically to align with the vertical path, right? So the marks that are in the water, I want to be thinking about the wave structure more than anything. And if there are light and dark patterns in the water, I can cut myself short. So there's this kind of triangular dark shadow there. You can see some deep shadows under here. So I try to visualize that shape and then create that using these marks that really kind of align with the wave pattern. In some of these areas it's really tight, and in some other areas it's a little bit more open. And if you're following along, one of the things to be mindful of is that we may be kind of calibrating the value relationships a little bit. So what happens as we start to draw, our brain will adjust to the lightest light and the darkest dark. So it'll look at the darkest dark in the drawing and start to see that as black when it's not. It'll look at the lightest light and start to see it as white. And then when you go in there and you drop in something that's either lighter or darker, then your brain has to readjust to that new value range. And there's this really cool shift in the water surface here. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to think about the way those marks shift from one spot to the next. And I think I'm just going to kind of suggest that for now. I'm not, in the reference image, there's a bit more going on in there, but it's such a tight spot that I'm going to not fuss with it too much. If you're working on a larger sheet of paper, you might spend a little bit more time in there. I think for now, it conveys that texture in the light structure a little bit, pretty well. So I don't need to add a whole lot more detail at this point. So. And then I see that reflection there of the iceberg in the water, and it's got some tone on the paper. And I don't think I need to lighten it. What I want to do is darken the area around it. And then if it's not sufficient, then I can, I'll adjust it. I'll lift up some more of that light. So you can see the reflection in here, it's darker and sharper in that smooth part of the water. And then as we come down here where there's that wind, the wind shear there, it breaks up that surface and it diffuses the reflections. So you get these kind of broader areas of light and dark. And that's true with, that's really kind of something to pay attention to in general is, the edges around a reflection, whether it's a highlight on a glass object or, a reflection in the water here, is that the texture of the surface is captured by how sharp or how diffused the edges are. So a more diffused edge suggests a rougher texture. A cleaner, sharper edge suggests a smoother texture. And so I'm changing the direction of my marks down in here because I can see in the wave pattern it kind of changes a little bit. And I'm not matching it one-to-one, but I'm kind of generally giving myself the kind of a bit of a boost in terms of the texture by just changing the direction of my marks. Again, using the side of the pencil. This is all going to have to be even darker. And this is really as dark as this ocean deep can go, and I know I can go even darker with the charcoal, the black charcoal. So I'm kind of just in my mind preparing myself for that. All right. I have to say this, all the challenges in 2020, one of the things I'm grateful for is this show. So thank you all for joining me on this adventure, and we're going to keep going straight through into next year. So all right, I think that's as far as I want to take that material for now. Now I'm actually going to bring in this black charcoal because this is going to help me to control my values a little bit. If I can get my darkest darks in here, and then I'm going to be able to evaluate the value structure in the iceberg a bit more effectively. But one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about are the distinct value ranges. So that water is really dark. The lightest light in the water is still darker than the lights in the sky or the iceberg. And so I just want to be kind of mindful of that as I'm going through. How's that work? So checking it out from a distance. Ethan is saying, how to have your own drawing style. It comes naturally. Drawing style is really kind of an interesting thing. So it's a really good question, Ethan. I mentioned earlier that I think of drawing, really it's mark making, right? You were making marks, and those marks ultimately represent our thoughts. So the phrase that I use a lot and remind myself of is marks are thoughts. And we can develop a skill, the skill of drawing, to more accurately represent the thoughts that we have. And I believe we do have our own particular way of working with the material. But that can change. It's like, with singing, for example, people can improve their singing ability, maybe their ability to hit certain notes, but we're all born with kind of a natural tonality to our voices that comes through. And I believe that to be true with drawing as well. Now you can kind of learn how to mimic somebody else's style, though. So, but I believe we do have kind of our own. We can't stop our thoughts from interfering with our drawing process. Our brain is doing a lot of stuff for us. Our brains, and so, I think the more you do it, the more your quote-unquote style will emerge. But there are two different ways of looking at that. There's your natural kind of mark making, but then there's also the images that you're working with. That influences the style as well. There's kind of essentially the design of the artwork. And so some artists they develop their own style more through the subjects that they're choosing, or the way they think through composition, color choices, things like that, rather than their particular quality of the marks that they make. And some other artists, it's really the quality of their marks that is the distinguishing factor. So a lot of different ways to think through it. I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts on it. See if there's anybody that kind of can connect with that or push back on that. I don't often think too much about style personally, but I know some artists that is a major focus, and so I think whatever works best for you. That's what's kind of cool about the art world. For some, style is everything, and that's awesome. There's some great work that's created out of that. So what I'm observing down in here are just some of the way some of the subtle wave patterns crisscross. So I'm going to start to kind of fill in some of those areas, but I don't want to get too fixated on there. And I'm not matching the reference photo one-to-one, but I'm hoping that it conveys the impression I get from the photo more than anything. Oh, James is asking, any comment on drawing from photos versus plein air? I'd love, again, that's another subject I'd love to hear your thoughts on. We talked a bit about that in the last episode. I believe Heather asked that question. I think in an ideal world, if I think you have the most to gain by working from life. Like I said, I'm a plein air painter primarily in my own work, and that's the thing I enjoy the most. I feel like I learn more about the world, or about the materials when working from life. Having said that, of course, I'm working from a photograph here. And I believe that there are opportunities to develop skill, whether it's hand-eye coordination or just learning your materials that can be achieved through working from a photograph. And then, of course, there are degrees from which you use the photograph. So some photographs are, sometimes, artists will work and they'll directly copy the photograph. Others will just use it as a starting point. Some will work on a black and white photo. Some artists will, project or trace photos. All of those things, you're in control of as the artist, but it depends on what your objective is. And so if your goal is to become a better plein air artist, then working from life is going to get you there faster than working from a photograph. But at the same time, I feel like I've learned a lot just by working from photographs in this series that I can apply to working from life. So I think a lot of it, like I said, it's about just putting into perspective what your objectives are as an artist and what's going to get you to that end result the best way possible. So I'm curious again to hear what your thoughts might be, if anybody has a different opinion. I know I've definitely talked with some artists that are much more opinionated about that in one direction or the other. And I definitely know artists who, work purely non-objectively, working purely abstractly, because just working from an image that is, not their, not the direction that they want to go in. And so there's lots of different ways that we can approach that topic. So I'm just kind of sharpening up this edge. You can see how much I've really ground that charcoal tip down, but I don't think I'm going to need it a whole lot. I'm just going to kind of clean up in some of these areas in here. And now that I have that value range established, I feel I can go a little bit darker in that sky. Let me see, is that what I want to do? Let me think. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to drop in some of these darker areas in the shadows in the iceberg. And so I want to be careful with these marks and just kind of tapping through so that I don't get these harder, kind of sharper lines that'll distract from that space. I'm just trying to kind of provide a little bit of a value context for that area to push those values a little bit more. And right in here, I can really sharpen up. And with this pencil being really ground down like this, what I'm doing is I'm paying attention, I'm rolling it in my fingers, because I'm trying to pay attention to, the shape of that tip and how it can serve the marks that I'm making. And I feel like it can be really effective sometimes just to use a sequence of dots and dashes to suggest a line, kind of like a constellation, rather than really being kind of explicit with a hard edge. Just kind of find the path and make these little dots along the way. And then right in here, I can really pull that out. Up here, I can go a little bit darker. Again, thinking about the texture, I'm not filling in that area, just looking for the areas where the shadows might be the deepest. And I kind of prefer to draw subjects that allow me to just kind of get lost in the mark making sometimes, that I can be a little bit more free with the proportions. That's why I kind of stress out about portraits. And I think some of you that have been with me for a while, you know that when I get to some portrait subjects, I struggle a little bit more. And sometimes it becomes really engaging just to kind of fall into a subject where you can just start making marks and see where that leads you. So in that area right there, that light is actually not too bad. I might have to lighten it up a little bit more, but I'm glad that I waited, because as I darken this area, it's pushing that contrast up there a little bit more. I see a few little proportion issues in some places, but that's all right. I think I'm going to let them be. This is a pretty small drawing. I think one of the things that would have benefited me is to work a little bit larger. I don't think it would have added much time to the drawing process, and it would allow me to work through some of those details a little bit more easily. So it's one of the things to think about for yourself. Sometimes we make the call to work on a small piece of paper because we think it's going to be easier, and sometimes it makes it harder because we end up fussing over these tiny areas. And when we just give ourselves a little bit more room, we can execute on those marks a little bit more effectively. Just want to check out some of the comments here. Mad Moments go, yeah, I went to art school. I went to art school. I spent 7 years in art school, 4 years in undergrad, 3 years in graduate school. I think, and that was really helpful for me. But that was 20 years ago, so it's it never stops. You're always getting better. I feel like I've gotten better over time, but that going to school gave me that boost. Cheryl saying, yes, painting from life and outdoor. Quick question goes with lights. I have quick changes with lights. That's what I would see. Yeah, that's a good comment, Cheryl. Yeah, when painting outdoors, that's what I love. I love the challenge of trying to capture things before the light changes. It is overwhelming. There's a lot that you end up having to simplify. Yeah, those are some good ideas there, Cheryl and JC. I think plein air painting makes you work faster, not getting caught up in so much in the minute detail. That's definitely true. At the same time, some of my favorite artists that work on plein air have incredibly detailed work. If you look at the work of Antonio Lopez Garcia, for example, he would work from life, sometimes for years on a painting, in some incredibly high detail. And there's a great documentary out there in which he paints the quince tree, and it's mind-blowing. So let me show. There we go. So, it depends on your approach to plein air. I work a la prima, so I generally get it done in one shot. But that's some artists that work from life go very slowly and achieve a high level of detail. But yeah, definitely, that's just a challenge that I prefer. Although I've been working in the studio a lot lately, and I kind of dig it. So it's fun just to change things up a little bit, Margaret is asking a really good question. Do you find that the more you draw, the more patient you become in your artistic practice? That is a really good question, and I have to think about that because my first thought is like, yes, but I don't know. I have to think about that. I don't know. Patience is really kind of interesting. Drawing does build a certain amount of confidence, and I think in particular it's the approach you might have to drawing that builds the patience. What I love about this whole series is that these drawings are really just for the experience of drawing, not for them as objects. I don't hang these up, for example. That's just not my objective, and that's really freeing because I want to be able to make mistakes and not have the pressure of it being for a specific purpose. If this was if this were commercial art, if I were doing this as an illustration or for some sort of design, then it would kind of change things up a little bit, and I may not have as much patience because I would feel that pressure. But so far, for the most part, my art has been for me, and that's been really freeing. So that is a really good question. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. So. And then James is saying, would you use white charcoal to reclaim the white to pull out both the eraser and both? Yes, I will be using whites for some, yeah. And then Krish, I see Krish is trying to ask a question, and I think I might have missed something. Oh, Krish is asking. Sorry, I missed that question, Krish. They kind of come in a little fast for me. But how do you? I think your question is, how do you become an artist? That is a really big question. So, let's see. Yeah, and Cheryl's saying you take photos and use them as a reference in landscape. So Chris, let me think about that question, how to become an artist, because I don't know as if I don't know as if I have that answer. It's such a big question that I want to provide a proper answer to that. If anybody else has some thoughts about it, I'm curious to hear your answers. I mean, I think part of the reason I think it's challenging to answer is because we all have our own associations with art and reasons for creating art. So if you're creating art for an audience, for somebody to look at, you create it and you're thinking about how is somebody going to respond to this, that might be different than if you're doing work solely for yourself. If you're a commercial artist, for example, and you've got a client, then you might have a different perspective on it than somebody who makes a living and you're trying to of selling the work and you're thinking about the gallery and what they want, or what your patrons, a different type of client, might want. So there's a lot to it, and I think there's when you factor in the idea of making a living at it, and the occupation of an artist, there's a lot of different ways that you can think about it, ranging from being a commercial artist, whether you're an illustrator, a graphic designer, or any of those kind of tangentially related fields. Those have different requirements than if you kind of a traditional fine artist who might be selling in galleries. There might be a different skill set, and there's a lot of crossover. I know a lot of artists who have done both or work in both kind of simultaneously. And then if you are an artist for yourself, then again, there's different criteria. Like for me, I'm largely an artist for myself at this point in my life because I don't sell a lot of work and I haven't really spent much time trying to. But I think when it comes down to it, it really just, whether you're making something or not, like what are you making and do you enjoy it? And then let the label of the artist come out of that. That's kind of my thought. It's long and rambling, so I hope that helps. Melissa's saying I have all kinds of supplies from tech school we never even got to during doing charcoal work, and I don't know where to begin. Oh, that's a good question. You might find some of the early episodes in this series helpful to get started with different materials. Let me think about that. If you go to the Drawing Together page on Artist Network, there are some additional drawing resources, and that might be helpful for you. There's a lot out there, on YouTube. I know we have a lot of resources at Artist Network. I think if you've got the materials, in particular the paper, then the best thing to do is just to start making marks, getting a feel for how it moves. And then kind of go from there. And then once you determine what particular skills you might need to develop to make them stronger, kind of target those skills. So whether it's light and shadow, for example, or perspective. But in terms of working with the material itself, find a good piece of charcoal drawing paper, and I'd say just start going for it. So I'm still working in the darks. I'm going to be pulling out the lights a little bit later as well. And Cheryl is saying, I sometimes do, but I also prefer to my photos. You're out in the element and have had easel blow away. I've definitely had that happen on Plein Air. Had my easel blow away. I went to graduate school up in Alaska, and my friend up there, he had a painting that he left out in the field overnight while he was working, and it was destroyed by a bear. I've had just about everything happen to a painting out in the open. That's kind of part of what makes it fun for me. I just like being outside. But Melissa's saying you just got an iPad Pro and you're learning to draw on it. That is awesome. I have been thinking about that. I've never drawn on an iPad Pro, so I'm curious what you think of it so far. And Mad Moments Go, it felt good when I illustrated a children's book cover back. That sounds really awesome too. have to look that up if you want to kind of give us a bit more info. Let's see, Mr. S says she's asking, how did I become an artist? Oh, is that what? Okay. Let's see. I decided to go to art school, so I went to a school called the Maryland Institute in Baltimore, right out of high school. And I hadn't done a whole lot of work, just some work in high school, but not a whole lot compared to some other, kids that I went to school with. Did that for 4 years, and then I ended up going up to Alaska to graduate school up there because I wanted to explore the landscape there. And that's generally been my path, and I taught for a long time at various colleges. And now I work at Artist Network. I'm a video producer here, so I produce a lot of instructional videos, and that's been really helpful working with the artists there to create instructional videos. I learned a lot from those artists, and so generally just being kind of part of that community, and it's very humbling because I realize that every step along the way there's a lot I don't know. I feel like I've become less confident as an artist than in some ways. So, all right, so I'm kind of going up over this edge here. I think I need more structure along in here, but I feel like the value range in here is working out okay, and I like the light behind there. What I want to do now is actually I'm going to switch to working on the background sky. Sorry, I want to get to some of these questions here. I also need to move the drawing along a little bit. So if I did miss any questions, I apologize, and I will do my best to kind of capture them. I try to ask them again. It's kind of hard to draw and monitor the discussion at the same time. Oh, saying it's nice to not have to clean up using the iPad Pro. Yeah, and Pat is saying a lot of artists end up teaching. That's definitely true from my perspective as well. I can agree to that. There's also, there's a lot of artists that have never taught. I think for me, it's where the overlap in art teaching and art making come in, that it really helps me as an artist to take some time to think about how I explain it. And then it makes those ideas a bit more concrete, and I apply them into my own artwork a bit more effectively. So that's just what kind of has worked for me in terms of the overlap between teaching and painting. So as I follow along this edge, again, I've got that sky color, this lavender, and I'm trying to be gentle, and I'm trying to be mindful not to create a halo around this edge. And I'm just kind of dropping in a sharper line, kind of like in little dots and dashes along that edge to sharpen it up. Trying to create a bit of a lost and found edge. And then this is where I can go a bit darker. I love seeing all these questions. I apologize if I'm missing any of these comments. So I do want to make sure that I continue to move through the drawing. So it's a little challenging sometimes. So thank you for your patience. Okay, so I'm just evaluating the drawing, looking at this edge now to see how that's holding up. I think I do need to drop down value a little bit here. So that area that I talked about earlier, like so far, still feeling I don't need to lighten it up. I think I can darken the area around it to increase that contrast. And I think I do want to darken this area in here. And I'm going to pump up the contrast along this edge a little bit more, make that edge a little bit more visible than what we're seeing in the reference photo, just to kind of create a sharper edge against that foreground iceberg clump there. Okay. Let's see. I'm sorry, I missed a bunch of questions during it. Owen the Dragon, Mad Moments Go. Owen the Dragon. My son's named Owen, so that's pretty awesome. Thank you for sharing that. We'll check that out. And then Melissa's saying, I love the iPad Pro, but I still love the feel of traditional art painting mostly. Yeah, that I can, I've heard that on the iPad, they've made a lot of advancements in the tactile aspect of it, and I'd be curious to check that out. But that was my impression very early on when working with tablets, is that I had a hard time with the texture of it because I'm just used to working with these natural materials and the feel of the paper. And you know, I see there's some amazing digital artists out there, and it kind of blows my mind that they're able to create what they do. My cat just came in. They're able to create what they do and make it, you know, have such life to it. So it's really cool from my perspective. I just haven't been able to make it work for me. I'm glad that people are enjoying the show. What is your next drawing? Next week I'll be working on a bridge. I'm working on a drawing of a suspension bridge. And that's Tybalt the cat who walked in, by the way. If you hear him, he's my buddy. But hey, I'm doing a drawing of a bridge, and I'm not sure which bridge it is, but it's kind of atmospheric, similar to this one. And the bridge kind of extends into the clouds a bit, and so it's got some really cool edge work that I'm excited to experiment with and play around with some perspective. What am I doing? So now I'm mostly kind of tweaking things. I feel like the bulk of the drawing is established, but I'm making some subtle adjustments to, you know, the sky area. And where do I want to go next? I'm going to have to work on that water, I think, a bit more. All right, now what I want to do, kind of thinking out loud right now because I don't really know what I'm doing next. now comes the kind of the improvisational phase of it. And one of the things we didn't talk about in this one is the ugly duckling phase, and I feel like this one definitely went through it. But I think every drawing, for the most part, you know, generally it's an exaggeration, but for the most part, a lot of drawings go through what's called an ugly duckling stage, where you feel like everything's just going to fall apart. But if you stick with it, you can kind of pull it together. And generally, mine, it's more often than not, they go through that ugly duckling stage. And I feel like this one definitely did that. So now to this eraser again. And I want to pull out the light and along in here. Especially up and along this edge here. And as I do that, I do feel like I need to work this background. I got to be really sensitive here. I need to drop just a little bit more value to get a little bit more contrast in here. And then feather it out so it's not super noticeable. I don't want it to feel like a dark spot, like a blotch behind there. But I want to drop in a little bit more material, so then when I use this eraser to create this sharp edge, it becomes more visible. And this is where I might need just a little bit of a really fine line to crisp that edge up. There we go. Switch to this blue. Sorry there, that required a little bit more concentration, so I needed to not talk for a little bit. And then Margaret is saying, thanks God, I agree. I'm finding the more I draw, the more I understand my thought process. That's awesome. That is really great to hear. And Melissa's saying, I never go into drawing on paper. I did start painting now, past few years, and I love the feel and texture of painting in acrylic. That's awesome. Very cool. Let's see. Happy holidays for those of you. Melissa's saying, yeah, Melissa's got some additional comments about, it looks like the iPad there that I want to kind of explore a little bit. It's hard to, again, it's kind of hard for me to read. I didn't enlarge the screen enough. So I'm kind of struggling to read the comments on the screen. So I apologize, it's a little clumsy of me. Oh, and then James is asking, do you do studies like this that become paintings? I do. So in general, actually, you know, this painting behind me here was painted from a small plein air study that I did. This up in Yellowstone, up at Yellowstone Lake. And so I did a plein air study, woke up at like 4:30 in the morning, and did a quick study, took a photograph, and then I created this painting from both the study and the photograph. But I didn't do a drawing study of it. And I know some artists that do. They draw their studies, but that's just not part of my process. Let's see. There's this kind of horizon line right up here that is a little sharp, and that helps to define that edge. I'm feeling like this needs a little bit more clarification along this edge here. So what I'm going to do is really a fine line using that blue, and it just falling on, dropping it down in a few small areas. I don't want it to read as a line. I don't want that to be the initial observation. But if I'm strategic and I just drop a few marks here and there along that edge, that can sometimes be enough to make that edge sharper and more visible while still being subtle. And then this here, what do we want to do? I do want to sharpen this edge up in here. There's the black. I need a little bit more depth in the shadow, so I'm going to come back in with the black here. And then let me see. Okay, now back with this eraser. I want to pull out this highlight here. And I can't remember who it was that asked about the white, but I will come in with I have my white charcoal at the ready when needed. So, but for now, what I'm going to do is with this eraser, essentially treat it like a piece of white charcoal, like a pencil, to lift out some of these areas. There's an edge here. How's that work? It works out all right. Okay. And then let's see. I think this. Pull out that light up there. And there's a little bit of, there's a thin sliver of light that comes down through here, and I don't really know what created that, but I like it. So I'm going to drop that in there. And then I kind of overstated that highlight. It was too large, so I'm going to fill in some of that space behind it. But I like the way that it comes into view there. It breaks up that edge. All right, so now in this area here, okay, pull up the highlight, looking at this ridge along here and trying to kind of create that edge variation. So I don't want that to be really a super hard edge there. And then under here, I can use this to kind of create a little bit of texture There's some kind of bounce light. Some light that kind of rolls down into the shadow area that gives a little bit more dimensionality. And that's really the key to effectively creating the illusion of depth through light, or the illusion of form through light, is to identify the average value and then a shadow core, like a darker shadow, and then a highlight. If you can at least get those three, then you can start to create a three-dimensional form. So this is just lifting up a little bit of some of these lighter areas here. And I think in order to kind of increase the luminosity, I'll pull out some of the light here along this edge. And then using the eraser, I'm still thinking about pressure, just like with a pencil. It's a drawing tool. It's not just a tool to correct mistakes. It's a mark-making object. So this is just going to give us a little bit more depth and life in the shadow areas. And so we said earlier, as I was making the marks in these shadow areas, trying to think about the shape of the marks in each of these areas as I move through, and try to capture the essence of those shapes rather than match it one-to-one with the reference photo. And in that way, it helps to create the illusion of texture. It feels more naturally formed than if I try to get in there and render every little shape, accurately, 100% accurately. Lift up some of that light there. Sorry if I'm dipping into the shot too much. Sometimes I forget to do that. My head kind of covers over the drawing. So if I'm doing that, I apologize. And I will try to be mindful of that. And then one of the things I'm looking at now is an alternating sequence of light and dark. That's ultimately what makes a drawing come together. So looking at the value relationships, this is a little bit darker, then lighter, darker, lighter, darker, lighter, darker, lighter. So when you look, when you're saying this is lighter or this is darker than whatever's next to it, that alternating sequence can be really helpful in organizing the values in the drawing and leading to something that is visually appealing, is to have a nice sequence of light and dark. And then and that ultimately is like a feeling. Does it feel good to you? It's really kind of an abstract thing. All right, here's what I want to do. I think I'm going to actually darken this a little bit more. So there's still a visible reflection there. And I'm going to drop that value down a little bit. And I'm using the blue, the same blue from the Iceberg, and that's bringing in some of that tone from there, some of that temperature shift. Kind of just blending the temperatures together a little bit. And then with this eraser, I can, actually, I want to darken this whole thing. I'm going to pull out some light from using the eraser. Let's see how that works. I don't know if this is going to work, but let's see. Kind of suggest that texture in here with that part of the iceberg reflecting in the water. And then same in here. I do want to sharpen this edge up. My black charcoal is really worn down, so I think that's the end of it. I'm not going to go back in and sharpen it. There we go. That feels better. I like that corner having some structure there. And then what I can do in here is darken this again. And then where there's this little glow of this reflected light, I can use my eraser and just with a light touch kind of lift off some of this and see how that works. And then actually I think what I need to do is this shadow, I feel like it could be deeper. then this shadow as well. There, I think that's what it needed along that edge to bring that contrast to this upper edge of that snow rather than the water line. There's too much emphasis on that water line. So just drop this value down a little bit, really drop that into shadow. Yeah. And I'd kind of lost the structure of the light and shadow in some of these areas. All right, sorry, I got a little distracted here drawing, so I'm going to come back to the come up to the chat here. And then James is asking, yeah, can I view previous videos? Yeah, if you go onto Artist Network here, you should be able to find the Drawing Together playlist. And then it's got all episodes. I think this is episode 73 or so. So we've got a lot on there. And I believe the playlist is organized chronologically. So, and you don't have to follow in a specific order. There's no kind of curriculum path or anything. It's just you kind of jump in with whatever subject you feel interested in drawing. You can go to the Artist Network, the Drawing Together page on Artist Network. There's a link in the description. You can also find the materials that I prefer to use if you need to buy anything. I have a kind of a curated list that you can kind of go through and just order. If you want to order everything you can, if you want to just order what you need and kind of replenish your stock, you can do that as well. All right, so I'm getting a little bit more structure in here, still working on this main kind of wall of the iceberg, back and forth between kind of lifting off some of these lights with the eraser and then dropping in some of those shadows. And now what I think I want to do is come back in with the white charcoal and see how this does. You know, along that edge, you know, the white can kind of blend with the materials a little bit. And this isn't really doing a whole lot in terms of lifting the highlights. So I'm getting a brighter white by erasing out the highlights. So I'm going to let those be. And what I'm going to use this white for is really a blending tool to affect the kind of the quality of the texture in some of those areas and maybe push that contrast. So some of these smoother areas on this wall, I can blend with the white. And that will hopefully create kind of a greater contrast in texture. So instead of using the blending stump to blend, I'm actually just using this white charcoal. And so it's just using a light pressure and letting it kind of just move things around. So like I said, it's not working effectively to pull out the highlight because I think the paper itself is brighter than the white charcoal. But I think it's still a helpful tool to have. And in particular, I think it's really helpful with some of the bounce light in the shadow area. All right, and here I can give a little bit more life to this area. There's so much texture in the shadow area that I've ignored up to this point, and so I can use this tool to help establish that. So it's really just a light pressure. Like I said, it's just giving me an opportunity to blend more than anything. And then Zeffy's asking if the hard line on the left is too much. I think it is. That's a good observation. Thank you for bringing that up. I think I would have kind of forgotten that. So asking if that line is too much. I think it is. You know, when I'm up close, you can see kind of a sharper edge. But in drawing it the way I did, I kind of overstated it, just as you're observing. So thank you for pointing that out. Anybody else who's drawing along, I'm curious how your drawing's coming together. Anybody got some nice icebergs? I'm happier with that. Now you can kind of get a sense of that bounce light in this shadow area and over here. I think I do need it a little bit over on this side as well. Roberto's asking, what's your favorite part of Christmas? That's a good question. Just nice to be around the people I love. I've got kiddos, so them opening their presents, it's hard to beat that. So and now that this drawing series has been put together, this is becoming part of my favorite as well. Here's where I think there's an opportunity. There's this very similar value shift there, and I'm losing a bit of that the structure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken this. And then I'm going to come back in and darken some of the shadow areas even more. Yeah, I think that really helps. It's a very subtle change, but it can make a big difference in how that edge sharpens up. And so most of this drawing, my eyes are actually out of focus. I try to keep them fairly blurred and then only bring it into focus when I really need to. How's that work? Let's see. But I think we're nearing the end. And so ultimately what I'm doing is kind of getting deeper and deeper with these shadows. It takes, for me at least, multiple passes over this stuff to really figure it out. And I'll use this white as a blending tool. And I can see some of these areas where they're just a bit smoother. So in particular, I want to target those, and that'll help with that texture. Texture is a funny thing because it's not something I really paid a whole lot of attention to really prior to this series. I spent so much time focusing on color and perspective and getting proportions right, and then texture was always seen kind of in my mind as just these, kind of like an extra that like, I don't know, and I just never really gave it much thought. But I started in the series really starting to think through texture and what it can do. And as I spend more time trying to simulate texture, I feel like it does add quite a bit to the drawing. So. And this whole area down in here is relatively smooth, so and just kind of smoothing things out. And that helps to create a little bit of contrast between the ice and then the water. So leaving the water rough. I haven't really blended that or smoothed that out much. Now I'm back and forth with this. Add a little bit of depth in the shadow areas. So it's just this kind of back and forth. Let me get back to your questions here. Kind of getting caught up in the drawing, so I apologize. So far, James is asking, so far the colors I've been using, yeah, essentially I've got the lavender for the sky. I've got this deep ocean for the water, and then the blue, mountain blue for the iceberg, and then white and black. So there's kind of 5 that I'm using, and it's pretty similar to how I paint. I don't use a very wide range of colors when I paint, but I have the ability to mix them and kind of create the colors I want. Okay, oh, and I don't want to forget this part. Oh, James is asking about the bamboo paper. Does it have a smooth texture? It's pretty rough. It's similar to like a cotton rag paper, and I can feel some of it kind of getting a little fuzzy on the paper. like on the surface there as it's being worked. Let's see. I think, what do I want to do? This whole area is bothering me. Both of these sides. I need to resolve them a little bit better, and I need to figure out what to do. So I'm kind of trying to think out loud how to make it work. Because right now they're feeling like stripes, not depth. I don't feel like I'm creating an effective illusion of depth here. So I'm going to work these spaces a little bit. And in particular, I need to figure out, let's see, I think maybe I do want to kind of erase out this, kind of create that backlight. And create a little bit more variation there. Maybe it's just that it wasn't really intentionally drawn. That was causing trouble. That feels a little bit better so far. Come across here. See, because the water line is actually up here. It all gets kind of blown out in the light there, but if I give a little bit more here, I'm kind of playing around with some stuff. I'm not really sure what I'm doing right now, so if I'm 100% honest. And so let me think. I'm just kind of going by what feels, observing what's working, and then adjusting from there. I think, yeah, what was happening is I was really prioritizing these horizontal stripes, and there's kind of a vertical quality to it as well. There's the way the light is reflecting off the water and kind of coming around the iceberg. It creates kind of almost a vertical kind of reflection there, and that's part of what I'm trying to observe. Yeah, and then I need to add a little bit more depth on this side. So I'm kind of artificially darkening this a bit more from the photograph so I can get that to pop off of that corner. And then as I come across, if I know the water line to be up here, and I want to carry it through over here as well. But the light is actually striking a little bit stronger on the cloud underneath it. So that's like some of these areas I'm kind of feeling out as I go, seeing what works and what doesn't, and hopefully it's not going to leave a kind of a permanent issue that's going to give me trouble. So I need to reestablish this edge. I'm going to actually kind of brighten this up a little bit more, kind of losing some of the subtlety in this area, but I need to pop that edge a bit. There, I think that's better. It's not exactly what's happening in the photograph, but I think it's serving the drawing a little bit better. And then under here, it's lighter back in here, and then this all just needs to be darker. Grab the lavender again. There we go. I think that works a little bit better, and I can create a little bit of variety. You know, we're really good at seeing subtle shifts in value, and we often overstate them. But kind of knowing that it kind of gives us an opportunity to be subtle in the drawing as well. A subtle shift in value can really go a long way in the drawing, so never kind of underestimate that. All right, how do we feel about that? Let's see. All right. Is the Titanic going to be making an appearance? That would be great. So now what I'm doing is I need to give a little bit more structure to this water here. And I think if I can add a little bit more detail, it'll go a long way. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to react to the areas that feel unfinished. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it has a high level of detail. And there can be a difference there. So sometimes something can be left like with very little detail, but it feels intentional and it feels like it finishes the drawing effectively. And then other areas, other times it becomes kind of a feeling just to assess whether an area is it just feels like the underdrawing. It doesn't feel like it's done. And I wish I could articulate that a little bit better, and perhaps I'll be able to as I think about it, but I don't know if anybody of you kind of connect with that feeling. That is a question we've had many times in this series, is how do you know when it's done? And that's a really good question. One of the criteria that I've used before is to simply relate it to my understanding of the subject. Do I feel like I've understood the subject enough through the drawing process? And when I feel like I'm just moving material around and I'm not really making any kind of clear statements about the subject, then I'll stop. But sometimes then it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes you need to just kind of put more work into the drawing because it's a distraction. An area could be a distraction. So what's happening for me now is I feel like this water is a distraction. It feels unfinished rather than something that my mind accepts as water and just kind of moves beyond. So I've got this lavender pencil just pulling in some of the colors from the sky along the edges where they become a bit more noticeable in the reference photo. That kind of warm shift, that lavender coming down and through here. So in terms of what's going to make that feel like it's done, sometimes I don't really know, and I just got to play around with it. Whether it's a texture, whether it's getting the value right. Maybe in here I need to blend with the white. Just get a different texture in there. I think that maybe it would be helpful over here as well. How does that work? I like that better. I feel like it feels more substantive there. And then, thank you all for being very patient with me. This has taken a little bit longer than normal, but I also am having a lot of fun and I don't want it to end. So, and James asked him, does the sky need more recession? I'm assuming you're talking about along the horizon line, pushing that back there. I think I agree that it does. It does feel very flat. It's not that ceiling that we want in the sky, but it's difficult to see in the reference photo. So what I might have to do is kind of look at that a little bit more closely to see if there's any clues in there that can help me to create more depth. I'll pull out just to place a little iceberg back in there, see if that helps. There's my lavender again. I feel like I need a little bit more lavender in here. This is kind of blending more than anything. Okay, perfect. James, just got your comment there. Yeah, let me look at that. I think that's a good observation. Let me pull in more of that blue in here. See how this works. So I'm just kind of working the space in here. I'm kind of experimenting with all of this to see what see how it all reads. If I were using paint in this area, I would be able to mix a more saturated color in here, but drop the value. I can't really do that as well here because I can't control the saturation of these materials. So I'm trying to think through, trying to see what's happening on the page and see what works for that. I like that idea. Okay, and then let me grab I'm going to need another charcoal pencil here because this other one's run down to nubbins. I just want to add a little bit more kind of structure in here. Yeah, I kind of lost some of that contrast in here, lost some of that shadow structure. And let's see, and then as I come down in here, there should be a little bit of variation. We're changing the texture a little bit, but how's that read? That works better. Okay. And then I do want to kind of sharpen up this. There's a shift into the dark here. So this water is just a series of I'm visualizing this diagonal path, but I'm creating it with marks that actually run this direction along a path that runs this direction. So there's kind of a crisscross effect. And it starts to create kind of this diamond pattern where the angle of the waves, as they wrap around this, they kind of converge and to create this kind of diamond pattern. I see some comments there that are requiring me to focus a little bit more, so I may have to, I'm going to have to come back to some of these comments here. I want to keep drawing while this is in my mind here. And then, but I do want to make sure I get to some of your observations here, guys. So. Yeah, right now I'm just kind of, this charcoal is not really taken onto the paper a whole lot, so it's starting to just slip around. So I feel like that works a little bit better. So in this area, it does feel more like a plane that's receding back to the iceberg rather than a flat sheet. And I think that might be what somebody is saying over here. Draw it out, lady. It almost appears like a sheet over the iceberg. I think it's the left side, in my view. Which is in reference has a straighter line between the fog and the darker area of the sky. Oh, yes, I think I see what you're talking about. Yeah, this feels more rounded than that sharp kind of wall. I wonder if that's what you're talking about, but that's a really good observation. I kind of lost some of that structure when I erased out this highlight here along that edge to sharpen up that edge. Then it rounded out into the shadow area too much. And so if I come back in with this and I can have established some of these shadow areas, especially that vertical edge, that vertical wall, that should straighten it up. So thank you for that observation there. That's why we're drawn together. And this is all very subtle. I think what I need to do is there's a little bit of light comes through in this area. I'm going to break that up a little bit. Along that edge. I can add a little bit more kind of structure to this side. And then I do want to get back up to that sky area that was mentioned earlier to give it a little bit more depth. I think as I've been kind of letting that run through my head as I've been drawing, and I think what I need to do is shift the color temperature on the sky. It's really the same color and value from horizon to the top that in my drawing, and that's flattening it out. So if I can create a little bit more variation, then I think that'll give it some depth. So what I'll do is, what is this one? There's the ocean deep. This is some of that ocean color. And let's see if I kind of vignette it a little bit, bring in some of that temperature shift, darken it a little bit up here, if that will do it. I think that just makes it a little bit richer. So great observations, everybody who's helped pull this together. Mad moments. Go, Sid. You kept your jacket on for this one. I knew somebody, there's an artist up in Alaska that would work down in Antarctica, would take trips down there, and I can only imagine. The coldest I've ever been outside painting was, right around 0 degrees, so right in the single digits there, and that was pretty brutal. And the paint does funky stuff, but I've never drawn in cold temperature. So just using my palm to kind of blend those together, and I think that gives a little bit more depth to the sky. What do y'all think? But I think I'm about ready to call it. I might be able to continue to kind of fuss around with the, with the details a little bit, but I think for the most part it's there. There's this little, I'm trying to think, there's this little glow that's happening right here, and I'm wondering if that is good or not. That's helpful. I kind of like it, but it is kind of weird at the same time, so I need to think about it. Let me see what happens if I get rid of it, and I can always get it back if I need to. Just want to be gentle with that. I kind of like that, although it feels like a little bit too blotchy over on this side. So let me smooth this out. Right now I'm just kind of playing around. It's kind of what I think about sometimes when I'm working. It's like, what if I just kind of tweak this a little bit and get rid of this here and there. And then everybody has you kind of your own kind of barometer when it comes to adjusting from the reference. I know some artists who deviate wildly from the reference, right? It's just simply a starting off point. They may look at the reference briefly and then let their imaginations run, and that's awesome to see. And then I know some artists who they adhere very strictly to the reference, and that's one of those things where we're all different in that regard. Yeah. Mad Moments Go was talking about using the blending stump here to smooth things. Yeah, I don't know why. I guess I kind of left the sky undone because I was thinking about keeping the iceberg smooth, but I kind of like, that was a good call. Kind of like that. Especially up around this edge, I think that can help to create more depth in that sky. Maybe let it be smoother here towards the horizon, and then a little rougher at the top. All right. Yeah, good call there, Mad Moments Go. James, you have made some good suggestions here. Whew. I'm beat. This is a tough one. But I really appreciate all of the comments, and I apologize for some of you I didn't get to any of your questions. So some of your questions there, hopefully I got, give you something to think about. If there is a question that you have that you really want me to answer, I'll hang on for a little bit if you want to ask those. But I think I'm going to set this drawing up. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just put it up for a little while, come back to it in a couple days and see if there are a few little tweaks here and there that might help. But for the most part, I think I'm done as I make more marks. I recognize the hypocrisy in those comments there, but that's what it is. Perfect. Thank you so much. A lot of great suggestions, a lot of great questions. We'll be back next Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll be drawing a bridge. That is, I'm a little nervous about that one because so far in my preparatory sketches, they have not gone well. But that's drawing for you. They're not always going to be winners. So I'm just putting that out there that it could be a struggle next week. So thank you all. Have a great holiday. Merry Christmas and everybody out there. That'll be before the new year, we'll see. So it won't be next year that I'll see you, but pretty darn close to it. So thank you all. Thank you all for making this an awesome year and joining me with drawing together and helping to build the community. I appreciate it. You're the best. We'll see you all next week.